Tonight's presentation is titled Misfueled with Jet A. Our presenter, Mike Bush. Mike is president of Savvy Aviation Incorporated. He's also a author for numerous aviation publications over many years now. Mike holds certified flight instructor certificate, A&P mechanics certificate, the IA privileges, 2008 FAA Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year, a member of EAA, just coming off a fabulous AirVenture. Mike shared with me he conducted 13 live seminars. We call them forums here at Oshkosh AirVenture. So Mike, thank you so much for doing that. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And I'm going to turn control the presentation over to you.
Well, thank you, Tim, and good evening, everybody. Let me see if I can grab a presentation here. Yeah, just back from AirVenture. I was actually away for 2 weeks because I spent the week before AirVenture in Tennessee, so I came back to like 2.5 weeks worth of mail and bills and all that stuff. But I think I'm sort of getting caught up a little bit. It was a wonderful AirVenture, really good turnout. The weather was cooperative, and it was great to be back after after missing a year of everything, missing 18 months of everything. My clock is completely off now. At any rate, wanted to talk about misfueling, which is an ongoing problem, a pretty serious one, and something that actually happened to me about almost 30 years ago. So I wanted to talk to you about my experience with this and some of the lessons that I learned about it, because it's kind of scary. But let me start off by talking about a couple of other misfueling situations that had somewhat worse outcomes than the one that happened to me, since I'm obviously here to talk about it. But in 2008, there was a fairly well publicized accident. It involved a Cirrus SR-22 turbo in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Airplane took off from Rio de Janeiro and wound up crashing and killing all 4 people aboard. The SR-22 was marked prominently with the words turbo on the tail, as you can see, indicating that it was a turbocharged Cirrus. And the lineman who fueled the airplane mistakenly interpreted the word turbo to mean that the airplane was turbine powered, which it obviously wasn't, and fueled it with Jet A. And pilot was not aware of that and took off with very tragic consequences. About 7 years later, there was another accident. It wasn't it wasn't a fatal, fortunately, but this was in 2015. A Cessna 421B, twin Cessna, which is it's kind of the big brother of the Cessna 310 that I fly. Wound up taking off from Lufkin, Texas, and crash landing on a highway shortly thereafter. You can see a picture of it here. Resulted in 1 serious and 2 minor injuries. Airplane landed kind of hard, but the pilot survived. And according to his testimony, when interviewed by the NTSB, he said the aircraft seemed to perform normally during the run-up, takeoff, and initial climb, but passing 2,100 feet above ground level, the left engine sputtered and lost all power. And then within 30 seconds, the right engine also lost all power. And so the airplane, the twin, had lost both engines. And I can tell you from experience, these airplanes don't have a real good glide ratio when they've lost both engines. But at any rate, he wound up making a forced landing, it landed hard, it damaged the wings and fuselage and ruptured the right fuel tank, but fortunately there wasn't a post-crash fire. And it came to rest on the grassy median of the highway. You could see that in the picture. When FAA people got on the scene, they said the smell of jet fuel was prominent at the accident scene, and the investigators found that the FBO's Jet A truck recently had its wide duckbill style nozzle replaced with a slim round nozzle, which it's not supposed to have, except that I subsequently learned that even though all turbine-powered airplanes are set up to accept the wide nozzle, there are some turbine-powered helicopters that the wide nozzle won't fit in. So it may be that that's why the FBO put this skinny nozzle on their truck, but at any rate, it wound up defeating the whole purpose of the wide bill nozzle. But in addition, that 421B did not have the fueling port restrictor rings that were mandated for these airplanes, including mine, in 1987 by airworthiness directive. There'd been a bunch of these incidents with turbocharged twin Cessnas because Cessna marked turbo all over these turbocharged airplanes. And so line people made the same mistake that they made with the Cirruses. So in 1987, an airworthiness directive came out requiring that restrictor ports be installed in all of the fuel filler ports. And I remember I bought my airplane in 1987 and it didn't have the ports, and I wound up having to comply with the AD. So I remember installing those restrictor ports in the airplane to prevent the wide nozzle from being able to be inserted in the tank. But this 421B did not have the restrictor rings, even though it was mandated by AD, and the truck had the wrong size nozzle. So even if it had the restrictor rings, that skinny nozzle would have fit in. So there were all sorts of issues leading up to this 421B accident, which fortunately it hurt the passengers, but didn't kill anybody. But that brings me to talk a little bit about my own experience, which was quite eye-opening, and that happened almost 30 years ago in 1992. I was at the time I was doing work for Visa International. I was doing software work for them, and their headquarters is up in Redwood City, that's just south of San Francisco. And so I would commute up there for meetings and stuff at Visa in my Turbo 310, landing at San Carlos Airport, which is a small but very busy GA airport that's just south of SFO. My airplane got repainted and it didn't say turbo on it anymore, but nevertheless, I wound up having a tip tank that was fueled with Jet A instead of 100 low lead. And fortunately, I caught the misfueler kind of in the act red-handed, and had I not been lucky enough to do that, I probably wouldn't be around to present this webinar, because San Carlos has a rather short runway for a twin. It's a 2,600-foot runway. And right off the end of the runway is the world headquarters of Oracle with 3 big giant towers. And so if something goes wrong on takeoff, there's really no good place to put the airplane, probably wind up in the bay or something like that. Now, normally I either fuel the airplane myself at a self-serve pump, or I try to watch it being fueled if it's being fueled from a truck. In this particular occasion, I had radioed for the fuel truck and waited for it to arrive, and I waited and I waited. And after 10 minutes of waiting, I had a call from Mother Nature that could not be postponed anymore. So I went inside of the terminal building to find a bathroom, and by the time I took care of my business and came back out to the ramp where my airplane was parked, the fuel truck was parked in front of my airplane, and there was a line person pumping fuel into the right main tank. On my airplane, the tip tanks are the main tanks. And as I approached the aircraft, I observed that the truck was labeled Jet A. Now, my first reaction when I first saw this was that this probably wasn't going to be a problem, because I had installed the restrictor rings that were mandated by the AD, and so theoretically the fuel truck couldn't fuel my airplane with Jet A, because the duckbill nozzle would not fit into those restrictor ports. It's designed to prevent this sort of thing. And the FAA requires that the jet fuel trucks have this spade-shaped duckbill nozzle, and that airplanes that are considered vulnerable, like mine, have restrictor ports installed so that the wide jet fuel nozzle wouldn't fit in. So in theory, misfueling the airplanes is impossible, but of course it's theoretically impossible for bumblebees to fly. And as Robert Heinlein said, everything is theoretically impossible until it is done. Well, it was done. When I got to my airplane, I discovered that the line person had topped off my left main tank with Jet A, and then he discovered his error, and he put the nozzle back down on the ground and radioed his office for help. Ultimately, the San Francisco FSDO investigated this and determined that their fuel truck had not been fitted with the duckbill nozzle. But at any rate, so here I have an airplane with a tip tank that was topped off with Jet A, and it had been about half full. And so now I had like a 50-50 mix of Jet A and 100 low lead in this tank. Unfortunately, I caught it. So I didn't start the engine, didn't go flying or anything. So now what do? I was there for a business meeting at Visa. I was all up, dressed up in business clothes, tie and a suit and all that stuff. And here I have an airplane half full of Jet A in one tank. And I started making phone calls, and I spent literally hours trying to find an A&P on the field that would help me purge my fuel system of its, its noxious combination of 100 low lead and Jet A. And this was almost 30 years ago. I wasn't an A&P myself, so I was sort of at the mercy of whatever A&Ps were there on the field. And the fueling company that did this deed, they were falling all over themselves to be helpful. I'm sure they were worried about being sued, but they didn't have any mechanics or maintenance capabilities. There were several shops on the field, but none of them wanted to touch the airplane, because all they could see was liability. So none of them wanted to help me purge the fuel system and get the airplane where I could fly it home. After many phone calls and much pleading, I finally persuaded one director of maintenance at one of the shops on the field to help me out after I agreed to sign a waiver absolving his shop of any liability that would happen in connection with this operation. And so we went to work trying to purge the fuel system of this mixture. So of course, first we drained the tanks as completely as we could, and put all the stuff we drained into a 55-gallon drum that the fueling company provided. This was going to be stuff that they would have to dispose of somehow. I'm sure it was not cheap to dispose of this stuff. But anyway, we drained the tank into this 55-gallon drum, but we knew that there was going to be jet fuel residue and jet fuel in the hoses and all of that stuff. So we disconnected the fuel line that was going to the engine-driven fuel pump. We drained all the fuel from that as well using the boost pump. And then we put 5 gallons of unadulterated 100 low lead in this empty tip tank, and used the boost pump to pump it through the system and into a bucket. And then we tested the bucket to see whether it was contaminated. And to do that, we used what we call a paper towel test. If you pour some fuel on a paper towel and let it evaporate, if it's gasoline, it will evaporate completely and not leave anything on the paper towel. But if it's kerosene, if it's jet fuel, it'll leave an oily ring on the paper towel. So that was the test to see whether this fuel was contaminated or not. So we put a few drops of the stuff in that bucket onto the paper towel, let it evaporate, and there was an oily ring on the paper towel. So clearly the system was still contaminated. So we put another 5 gallons of 100 low lead in and pumped it through the system into the bucket, and then tested it with a paper towel. And it flunked again, and we had to repeat the procedure 3 more times. And in the meantime, all this 100 low lead was being supplied at no cost by this fueling company that was terrified of being sued. They were very cooperative, but they didn't have any mechanics. And eventually, after 5 flushes with 5 gallons each of 100 low lead, we finally got something that didn't leave a stain on the towel, and we were satisfied that the fuel system was purged. So then we reconnected the fuel line, cowled everything up. The fuel company topped off the airplane at no charge. And this whole thing took about 6 hours after the misfueling incident. That included the time it took me to find somebody to help, and then all this purging process, and finally it was good to go. So some lessons learned from this interesting episode that could have been an incident or an accident, or very likely a fatal accident had I not caught it. One of the key things I discovered is that it's impossible to distinguish a pure avgas and a mixture of avgas and Jet A by color. I mean, as a private pilot, we were always taught, if it's avgas, it's going to be blue, or if it was the old 130 octane, it was going to be green. But nowadays it's all 100 low lead and it's colored blue. And if it's Jet A, it's going to be straw color. But nobody ever taught me during private pilot training what the color of a 50-50 mix of avgas and jet fuel is. And if you think about it, that's really the issue that we're going to face in the field, because if an airplane is misfueled with jet fuel, it's almost never going to be a tank that's completely empty. It's going to have some amount of 100 low lead, and then the misfueling is going to add some jet fuel to it. So what's the color of the mix of jet fuel and avgas? Well, it turns out that a mix of jet fuel and avgas looks exactly the same color as pure avgas. It's blue, and you literally cannot tell the difference just by looking at the color. And that was quite a shock to me, because nobody ever taught me that. So I thought that was an important thing for people to know, because when misfueling happens, we're never dealing with a situation where it's 100% jet fuel. It's always going to be a mix, because there's always going to be some avgas in the tank when the fueling happens. So you can't just tell a difference visually. The other thing that I was taught as a private pilot that turns out not to be exactly correct is that because jet fuel is significantly heavier than avgas, 6.7 pounds per gallon as opposed to 5.85 pounds per gallon, that the jet fuel and 100 low lead will separate, and the jet fuel will wind up at the bottom, and the 100 low lead will wind up at the top. And then if you drain the tank through the quick drain, you're going to get something that isn't blue. Well, that's true only if this mixture sits in the tank for a very, very, very long period of time. It turns out that 100 low lead and Jet A mix very well, and then the mixture takes a surprisingly long period of time to separate. It's not like water in avgas, which immediately goes to the bottom of the tank. So unless the misfueling happens and then the airplane sits overnight or something, when you drain the tanks, you're going to get something that's blue. So there are at least two good ways to distinguish pure 100 low lead from kerosene contaminated 100 low lead. One is to smell it. Jet A is a very distinctive odor, detectable even in small concentrations. And of course, I mentioned before when we were talking about the 421B accident that when investigators came on the scene, the place reeked of jet fuel smell. It's very distinctive. An even better test is a paper towel test. When in doubt, if you pour a sample on a white paper towel, even a white piece of paper or something, and let it evaporate, it'll leave an oily ring if there's jet fuel in it, and it will evaporate completely if it's pure gasoline. So let's talk about what happens if you don't catch this and the engine starts to run on a mixture of 100 low lead and Jet A, which is typically what we're dealing with. And this mixture is kind of nasty stuff. The best way I think to think about this problem, it's a little bit oversimplification, is to think of Jet A as being gasoline with a 0 octane rating. Octane is a measure of detonation resistance. So think of Jet A as being fuel with 0 octane. If you ever tried to run a piston engine on pure Jet A, it would go into instant destructive detonation, and you would never get to apply takeoff power because the engine would be seriously messed up, before you ever got to the end of the runway. But that's not what happens in the real world. You aren't running this engine on pure Jet A. You're running it on some mixture of Jet A and 100 low lead, and what the percentage of the mixture can vary all over the place depending on how much Jet A was put in the tank and how much fuel, how much 100 low lead was there to begin with. So the real world problem is not running on pure Jet A, but running on a mixture. And depending on the ratio of Jet A to 100 low lead, the effective octane rating of the fuel can be anything between 0 and 100 octane. The more Jet A is in there, the lower the effective octane rating will be, which is resistance to detonation. So a mixture with a lot of Jet A and just a little 100 low lead would probably be detectable during run up. The engine would go into detonation and the CHTs would go crazy and it would run real rough. But a 50-50 mix, which is basically what I had in that main tank, because it was approximately half full when I called the fuel truck over. A 50-50 mix would probably go through run up perfectly normally and would not start to detonate until full power was applied. And the engine might fail, 30 seconds after takeoff or 3 minutes after takeoff. Just a small amount of Jet A contamination might produce only moderate detonation that wouldn't really hurt anything, except maybe it would cause some spark plug insulators to crack, or maybe it wouldn't be noticeable at all. Light detonation just cleans off everything. Cleans off. It's like sandblasting the combustion chamber. Everything comes out really clean, and all of the deposits are gone. But the heavier the detonation, the more likely you are to go into thermal runaway and start melting pistons and doing really bad things. So depending on the ratio, the symptoms might be undetectable, or they might be, a minor thing like cracking spark plug insulators, or it might be a giant thing like melting pistons, and maybe the molten aluminum would get in a bad place and pretty much destroy the whole engine. Those two accidents I started off with talking about, the SR-22 and the 421B accident, remind us that this problem is still with us despite the FAA's efforts to eradicate it with restrictor ports and duckbill nozzles and all of that stuff. So as pilots, we need to be vigilant for this. Always watch your airplane being fueled if you possibly can, to make sure that it's being fueled with the right stuff. Make sure the filler ports are equipped with restrictor openings that a duckbill nozzle won't fit into. That's not 100% guarantee against misfueling, but it certainly would help in a lot of cases, assuming that the fuel truck is properly equipped. And then when you drain the fuel, from, don't just look at it, sniff it. If it smells a little funny, go to a restroom, get a paper towel, and pour some of it on the paper towel. See if it evaporates cleanly or if it leaves an oily ring, because this can be pretty darn serious. So, Tim, that's all the prepared material I have, but I would be happy to open things up for some Q&A.
All right, Mike.
Did I catch you
Let's
by
jump
surprise?
in. No, I wasn't sleeping here yet.
Okay.
No. So John just wanted to say another kind of fueling mishap at his school. He said at least 2 fuel gauges that has slipped through people's fingers into the fuel tank. Is this urgent or can they slosh around for a while? I don't know. Maybe he's talking like a dipstick. Maybe he's got a tank where they actually dip it and the stick fell in, it sounds like.
Well, it most likely, if you dropped something large and solid into the fuel tank, it probably wouldn't hurt anything. It's assuming it's not fuel soluble. If it was fuel soluble, then it might wind up being some kind of sticky goo that could mess things up. But it probably wouldn't hurt anything, except it would reduce the capacity of the tank just slightly. But the typically the way fuel tanks are set up, there's where the fuel tank feeds into the fuel supply line. There's a fairly coarse screen that protects the system from ingesting any large particulate matter that might be in the fuel tank. And in most airplanes, there's at least 2 or 3 levels of fuel filtration before the fuel gets to the engine, because there's a fairly coarse screen at the tank port, and then there's a gascolator that has a finer screen, and then if it's a fuel injected engine, normally there's an even finer screen in the fuel control unit of the fuel servo, to prevent even very small particles from clogging injectors and so on. So my guess is it probably wouldn't hurt anything, but it's certainly bad form to drop stuff like that into the fuel tank.
Carol wonders, in retrospect, why do you think it took so many flushes to rid your plane of the Jet A?
It's just nasty stuff, and the paper towel test is a pretty sensitive test. So probably if we hadn't flushed it 5 times, probably there'd be just a little residual jet fuel in there, and very likely the engine would have been okay running on just slightly contaminated fuel. But when you're doing something like this, you don't want to take the risk, so you want to make sure that it's purged as completely as possible. So we were trying to be very thorough, which is always a good practice when you're working on an airplane.
George
There's
wonders,
a lot of surface area there that got coated with kerosene, and so it just took a while to clean it all out.
George wonders, does Jet A affect seals or gaskets?
I'm not a fuel chemist. I'm not aware that it's particularly aggressive. I think jet fuel has less solvent properties than gasoline does. So my guess is it probably wouldn't hurt.
Dan wonders, what is required to fix an engine after running on a mix of Jet A and 100 low lead?
Well, it depends on what happens to it. But I remember years ago, there was an incident in Northern California where Chevron somehow screwed up, and there was a whole bunch of contaminated 100 low lead that had some jet fuel in it that they distributed, and somehow it wound up in a whole lot of airplanes. And I'm not aware that it caused any crashes or anything like that, but Chevron wound up paying for a whole bunch of teardowns in an abundance of caution. I think their lawyers advised them that that was the safest thing to do. I mean, if it were up to me and I was paying the bill, I would just do a careful bore scope inspection. If I had an engine that I knew had run on contaminated fuel, I would just do a careful bore scope inspection, and you should be able to see whether there are any detonation signatures on the piston crown or any fractured spark plug insulators or anything that would indicate an issue. And if the engine is equipped with a recording engine monitor, you can also check the history of the data history of the engine, see if there were any CHT runaways that would be indicative of a detonation event. And if things look good under the bore scope, and if I didn't see any indication in the engine monitor data of a thermal runaway, I would say, well, okay, the engine is okay.
Frank wonders, what would a modern engine monitor indicate when Jet A is being burned?
Well, if detonation occurs, which is what the threat is when there's enough Jet A mixed with the fuel, the indication is that the cylinder head temperature rises pretty rapidly, and it can rise to well over red line. In fact, in the most serious cases, we get temperature rises, and we've got tons of data of things like this. The temperature can rise 1 degree Fahrenheit per second until it gets so hot that things start to melt. That's if it's really heavy detonation. But detonation comes in all flavors. Again, I think as a private pilot, I was taught, and a lot of mechanics, I've looked at some of the FA training materials. They have the whole wrong concept about detonation, because they sort of teach that detonation is one of these binary things, that it either happens or it doesn't happen, and if it happens, it blows up the engine. If it doesn't happen, it's all good. But it's not like that. Detonation comes in all different severities, from very light detonation, it's hardly noticeable, to moderate to heavy to very seriously destructive. And the best way to determine whether an engine's been damaged by detonation is to do a bore scope inspection of the cylinders. And a confirming thing would be to look at the engine monitor data and see if there was any evidence of a CHT runaway.
Michael wonders, does or can the exhaust smoking excessively be another clue to misfueling?
I'm not aware that happens. I wouldn't think that the exhaust would smoke. I wasn't in a position to look at any exhaust, so I can't really tell you in terms of any kind of first-person experience. But my best guess is that it would not manifest itself with a smoky exhaust.
Jerry wonders, can you hear detonation like you can in a car?
You typically can't, because everything's making too much noise. Now, some of the modern computerized ignition systems, or computerized fuel injection systems, have detonation sensors that are basically knock sensors that will detect the shock waves that are created by detonation, which is what you hear in a car if you have bad fuel, or if you're going up a hill in the wrong gear or something like that. You hear a knocking sound, but typically you can't hear that with an airplane engine. You could hear it if a sensor can hear it if it's mounted on the engine, but typically if you're sitting in the cockpit, you can't hear it.
Bob says, why not fit each fuel port with a decal that states the fuel type?
Well, in fact, every fuel port is required by regulation to have a decal on it. but that doesn't
Even
guarantee.
experimentals have to have that, the type of fuel and then the quantity. Even an experimental
Yeah,
aircraft has to have that.
but that doesn't guarantee that the fueler is going to read it and check. I mean, you know, a lot of the fuelers are very young kids and stuff, so you can't.
Mistakes
That's
can
not a
happen, right?
guarantee. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay. Couple people are wondering, what about the opposite? What happens when you misfuel a Jet A powered aircraft with 100 low lead?
I don't really know the answer to that. I know the answer to it for diesel engines, because diesel engines will run with a fair amount of gasoline mixed with the diesel fuel. I think diesel engines will run on Jack Daniels, but I really don't. I don't know about jets. I just don't have any experience with it.
Thomas wonders, how did your 310 run on the way home after that, and were you sweating it?
I wasn't sweating it on the way home. I was sweating the takeoff because, like I said, it's a short runway with no good options. But once I was above the top of the Oracle Tower, I stopped sweating things.
Harlan says, would you recommend an extended run up after flushing or not taking off with the affected tank?
Well, in my airplane, I didn't really have the option of taking off on any, on other than the affected tank, because you're not permitted to take off in a twin Cessna without both fuel selectors being set on the respective main tanks. The left engine runs off the left main tank, and the right engine runs off the right main tank. And if you switched it to crossfeed or something like that, I'm not sure you could get enough fuel flow to support full takeoff power, because the crossfeed lines are a smaller diameter than the main fuel lines. So that wasn't something that I considered doing. I suppose, you know, if you were flying a Cessna 210 or something, where you just had a left and a right tank and you could switch between them, and then if the left tank somehow was contaminated, since you're allowed to take off on either main tank, it probably would make sense to take off on the tank you knew where it wasn't contaminated, just in an abundance of caution. But I mean, I was satisfied after we did all our flushing and all our paper towel tests and stuff that the system was clean. Took a long time, but
Couple questions about the new just approved STC fueled, so
oh,
Bart's questions kind of.
that's great. You know, one of the questions that came up during the Q&A that George Brawley did at AirVenture, I actually donated one of my 13 forum sessions so that George could do a Q&A session on G100 UL. But the question came up, well, what color is it? And it turns out that G100 UL is not dyed, and it's a sort of a straw yellow color, which sounds an awful lot like the color of jet fuel. So if you can't tell the difference in color on 100 low lead, you're sure as hell not going to be able to tell the difference with G100 UL, because it's pretty much going to be the same color as jet fuel is. But so
Many people are wondering then maybe the smell test.
Yeah, you have to sniff it, and if there's any doubt in your mind, then you should go get a paper towel.
I know the Swift fuel, the 94 UL Swift fuel, is totally clear. So Michael's wondering, could one possibly fit an automotive NOx sensor to an aircraft engine with a red light warning, for example, if it's experimental? Would there be any utility in that, he wonders?
I don't know. It'd be, since it's experimental, you certainly can do it. It might be worth doing. But it's also, I think, important to have an engine monitor. I mean, I've waxed poetic about how important it is to have an engine monitor just about every webinar I've ever done, and to have alarms set so that if the cylinder head temperature starts getting too hot, that an alarm goes off and gets your attention. Because if the engine goes into detonation, that's going to happen. Now, if that happens at 500 feet off the ground, it's probably not going to do you a whole lot of good, because you're not going to have time to do very much. But
Dan wants to know, does Jet A smell like kerosene?
yeah, absolutely.
And Bivano is asking, the fuel servo was not contaminated since your mixture was in ICO question mark. Is that correct?
No, well, it's not really correct, because the way that at least the Continental servo works is all the fuel goes to the fuel control unit, and then if the mixture's an idle cutoff, it sends essentially all the fuel back via the return line into the tank. So it goes through the fuel control unit even if the mixture's an idle cutoff. But our purging procedure, purge that whole loop.
Several people have kind of chimed in here, must be familiar with the turbine operations, but many people have kind of said something like John says, and that's a lot of turboprops and some jets are authorized to run on 100 low lead a certain number of hours between overhauls.
That's interesting. So it won't blow them up.
Apparently not right away.
Good. So this is mainly a problem that we have as piston drivers.
Andrew wonders, I may have missed it, but I was wondering how often this happens, and is it required to be reported if it happens?
Well, I don't know how often it happens, but it certainly, there's certainly seems to be a high profile case of misfueling every year or two. As far as reporting requirements, that I guess that's all covered by NTSB 830, that says what the reporting requirements are. The FAA doesn't have any reporting requirements. It's all NTSB stuff.
Kurt is curious, Mike, was this incident one of the reasons you later became an A&P?
No, although I mean, I must say that I feel a lot more in control of things, knowing that that I can work on my own airplane than I did before, when I was at the mercy of other people. It's a very helpless feeling that I had, say, at San Carlos, where I had an unflyable airplane and nobody wanted to help me because they were all just scared of liability. And I can understand why it looked that way, because to them that this just looked like a liability situation. But this whole business about being scared to do something because you're afraid of liability is a real scourge in aviation, and an awful lot of bad stuff happens because people are scared of the liability and scared of being sued and so on.
Fred says, I was taught over 40 years ago that if you mixed any two grades of aviation fuel, including the jet fuel grades, that the color of the fuel drained from the sump will always be clear. Is that not true?
It's not true. I mean, I can tell you from firsthand experience that if you mix 100 low lead and jet fuel, it comes out blue. It smells bad, but it's the same color.
Some people are wondering about locking fuel caps. Are they available for aircraft, and should they be purchased if they are?
No, that's a good question, but I'm not sure how that would affect misfueling. Because obviously, if you're going to fuel your airplane, you're going to have to unlock the fuel caps. I don't think I've ever seen locking fuel caps, but that doesn't mean that they aren't available. I just don't know. But I don't see how that bears on this issue.
John wonders, did you have to rock your wings in order to get your wing tanks rinsed enough by sloshing it around?
No. The tip tanks in the 310 have essentially zero unusable fuel, and when they drain completely. They've got kind of a little sump area at the very bottom of the tank that protrudes down from the bottom of the tank, and that's where the fuel is fed from. So there wasn't really any unusable fuel to worry about. We pumped it all out. That might not be true with other aircraft with other tank designs. It might not even have been true if my aux tank had been misfueled. But of course, if my aux tank had been misfueled, I wouldn't have been quite as concerned because I wouldn't be taking off on the aux tank. But it was the main tank that was misfueled, and it was the only tank that I could use for takeoff, so it had to be purged completely.
Hicks wonders, I know that when I fly an Eclipse jet, we put Prist in the jet fuel. Have you ever put Prist in 100 low lead?
I haven't, but it's one of the things that's authorized. There's a special kind of Prist that you use for gasoline powered engines. It's called low flow Prist, and but it's designed as an anti-icing thing for piston aircraft. There are actually two approved anti-icing additives. Low flow Prist is one, and anhydrous isopropyl alcohol is the other that can be used to prevent fuel system icing. Typically, that's a problem with fuel injected engines that take off from a hot, humid airport and climb way up into the flight levels where it's extremely cold. And there have been a number of accidents caused by fuel system icing, including some accidents with twins where both engines iced up. But yeah, low flow Prist and anhydrous isopropyl are both approved to be added to 100 low lead for as an anti-icing thing.
Jerry asks, how were airplanes named in the AD requiring filler rings? It seems my aircraft has a large enough opening for a Jet A nozzle to fit.
Well, I don't know the answer to that. The AD that I was citing on those slides was AD that was specific to twin Cessnas, and it covered pretty much all of the twin Cessnas. Whether there were similar ADs for other makes and models of airplanes, I don't know, but that particular AD only covered twin Cessnas, and it came out in 1987.
Doug's wondering, if you discover at run-up that something is amiss and it's Jet A, how would you purge the engine?
Well, I mean, you'd purge the fuel system, and then you'd stick a borescope in the cylinders to see if the engine had been damaged. But that's pretty much all you can do. You know, if there, even after you purge your fuel system, maybe there's a little bit of residual jet fuel in the fuel line or the carburetor flow bowl if it's carbureted. But you know, running the engine at idle for a little while is going to clean all that stuff out. And typically, unless you were running it on pure jet fuel, which virtually never happens, you're not going to have a problem with the engine running at idle. It's only when it's developing a lot of power and it gets to the point where it starts to detonate that the problem occurs. So most of these accidents happen when there's contaminated fuel. It's not detected during taxi. It's not detected during run up because it's not enough power to cause detonation. And then you apply full takeoff power, and the detonation happens and things start coming apart.
Mm-hmm. George wonders if you suspected misfueling because of engine problems immediately after takeoff. Is there anything you can do at that point other than shut the engine down or engines and make an emergency landing?
Well, I mean, let's assume that say it's a 50-50 mix of 100 low lead and jet fuel, like it was in my airplane. Um, it, the, basically, what I'm about to say applies not only to fuel contamination, but to any detonation situation for whatever reason. If you detect detonation, which would most of the time you detect it because there was a CHT runaway, and hopefully your engine monitor CHT alarm goes off and gets your attention, and you see that the CHTs on one or more cylinders are going nuts. The first thing you do is you pull the throttle back to idle to stop the runaway, and then you gradually bring up the throttle to the minimum power you need to continue controlled flight, probably slow flight. That hopefully is low enough power that you're out of the detonation range, and then you put the airplane down on the closest runway you can find and stick a bore scope in there and see what kind of damage got done.
Talking about bore scopes, David just made a comment. Mike, thank you for recommending the Vividia AbleScope VA-400 USB rigid bore scope with 180-degree articulating 8.5 millimeter diameter probe. With so many choices, I would have never found this one, and they've upgraded the camera to HD, so he's thanking you for that recommendation.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. The only bad thing is they upgraded the camera to HD, but they didn't change the model number. So if you order a VA400 right now, you're not quite sure whether you're going to get the new one or the old one. But yeah, they just upgraded the camera on that thing to make it even higher resolution than it was before. But it's a tremendous bang for the buck. It's a $250 bore scope, and it makes really, really good pictures. And it wasn't too many years ago that bore scopes cost 2,000 or more and didn't even have picture taking capability. They were just optical bore scopes, and the price of those things has come down dramatically, and the quality of them has gone up dramatically, and it's really great.
So Bruce just wanted to comment here. He says one way to solve this problem, do not have the aircraft fueled unless you are present with the fueler.
Well, that was certainly my intention at San Carlos, but my bladder took precedence over the fueling somehow. So
Oh, yeah,
it,
Larry
it can
and
happen.
it can happen. Yeah, somebody mentioned one time, Paul Shuck did a webinar on fueling also last month, and there was a comment about putting tape over the top of the fuel filler cap, and the tape would basically say, 100 low lead on it only.
Mhm.
Larry just wanted to make a comment here, asking kind of an unrelated question. Let's kind of finish up on this one, but Larry says, many of us had to fly through smoke layers to and from Oshkosh this year. Did this action cause any damage to our internal combustion engines?
Probably not. Assuming that you weren't flying through like volcanic ash or something like that, or a sandstorm, it probably didn't do any damage. There's certain kinds of air contamination, like as I mentioned, volcanic ash or sand that can cause problems, but normal smoke will just go through the engine, won't hurt anything.
And Catherine wanted to know, are there any types of paper towels that should not be used for testing?
I don't know. What do you mean, like Bounty or something? I have no idea.
Well, I'm thinking shop towels, when you get the kind of the heavier duty shop towels that are
Well,
blue or something.
it'd be very helpful if it was a white paper towel. Yes,
Yeah,
I guess
white paper
I should have qualified that.
towel. Uh-huh. All right, Mike, let's wrap it up here. Great presentation. Let's end a little bit short tonight and take a moment and share closing thoughts with everybody. Looks like we had probably about 470 people on board with us.
Okay, well, very good. I meant to make a slide for this, but if you want to get on my mailing list, there, in addition to going to this Aviation website or clicking the thing on the post-webinar survey, I've got a new text bot. I put that up for AirVenture specifically so that people could get on the mailing list, because I'm going to send everybody on the mailing list copies of all the slides that I used for my 13 AirVenture presentation. But if you, the way I told them, and it's still in effect, if you want to get on the list, you can text the word savvy, SAVVY, to the number 33777, and a magic text bot will come and ask you for your email address, and then you'll get copies of all my slides and you'll get my newsletter and stuff like that. So I'll have a slide for that next time, but we've got, I don't know, 500 or 600 people at AirVenture signing up for that stuff, because I get a lot of requests for copies of my slides. And so I decided this year we would come up with something innovative to allow people to sign up easily and at the show and get them. You know, my books are available on Amazon or at the EAA bookstore or at Aircraft Spruce. And if you have read my books and want to do a nice thing for me, you can go on Amazon and post your reviews of the book. Hopefully they'll be good reviews, but whatever you think, just post the reviews. And the upcoming next 3 webinars, first Wednesday of each month, September, we'll be talking about some of the interesting machine learning stuff that we're doing, where we've done some really interesting work on predictive analytics, where we let them pass thousands and thousands of engine monitor data from thousands of flights through a machine learning algorithm, and teach it how to distinguish when there's failing exhaust valves. So I'll talk a little bit about what we've learned. That's an ongoing project. It's quite interesting. And in October, I'm going to talk about another interesting experience I had, but this one was very recent, where I was flying down to a very busy airport in Southern California, Hawthorne Airport, just south of LAX, to pick up my fiance, and I had a main gear tire blowout, and that was the beginning of a very interesting ordeal for how to get my airplane airworthy again, where I could fly it back home. So I'll tell the story of that, because there's a lot of interesting things that happened. And finally, in November, I'm going to be talking about, the title of the webinar is Hot Jugs. We're going to be talking about excessive cylinder head temperature and how to diagnose the reason for it, how to fix it. There are a bunch of different things that can cause excessive cylinder head temperature. It's a very common complaint. So I'll be talking about the various ways of, diagnosing it and resolving it. So that's it. Tim,
Fantastic, Mike.
until next month.
Until next month, September
Yep.
1st, we'll meet again here, folks. Thank you all so
And
much for joining us.
for those of you who I met at AirVenture, which was quite a few people, it was a delight to do that, and I'm looking forward to doing that again next year.
Thank you very much, Mike, for this presentation, and everybody who tuned in. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. See you next time.
Yeah. Good night, everybody.